This presentation is going to discuss the information from Chapter 2, which covers things like cell and tissue characteristics. As with all units, make sure that you review the unit learning outcomes. There are readings and information within the text that don't show up on the ULOs and that we're not going to talk about here. Just a reminder that what you'll be evaluated on and what I will specifically ask you to know will be closely related to the ULOs and the presentations, and then use your reading to supplement those. If there are things you're finding in the reading that I'm not covering in either videos or in class or in the ULOs, those are things that you can safely kind of skip through. Okay. All right. So let's get started. So the first ULO and the first thing we're going to talk about is the cell membrane. The cell membrane is very important. It's one of the most important structures of the cell. And it's one of the most important things for you guys to understand because there's a lot of things about the cell membrane and its individual functions that will sort of come up again and again in a lot of the other disease states that we talk about. So understanding kind of some of this basic information about the cell membrane will really help you understand some of the disease states and why things maybe go wrong in certain disease conditions. So this picture kind of shows just your basic cell membrane. The cell membrane is what we call a lipid bilayer. So if you're looking at this photo, you see that kind of here, this phospholipid bilayer. And it surrounds the cell and really keeps it separated from the surrounding external environment. It provides kind of the basic structure of the cell membrane, but because of its properties, which we'll talk about briefly, you'll also see that it has these proteins. One here, we call these integral proteins, or these sort of peripheral proteins. So again, that lipid bilayer is providing kind of the basic structure of the cell membrane, but the proteins that are embedded or peripheral to that cell membrane really carry out most of the specific functions of the cell membranes. Peripheral proteins, like you see here, serve often as receptor sites for things like signaling molecules. And these transmembrane proteins, or these integral proteins, are frequently transporters for things like ions and other substances across the cell membrane. So the other thing to note about this lipid bilayer, so all of this layer that you see here, is that it has its water-loving heads or its hydrophilic heads kind of on the outside of that bilayer. And so where they end up is along the external portion of the cell and in the internal environment. So again, these kind of little water-loving heads. And then their lipid-loving tails, which you see right here, these what we call hydrophobic tails, are sort of lined up inside or towards the center of that lipid bilayer. We talk about that because that'll be important later for understanding what moves through that membrane most readily. Some things move in and out of a cell membrane really easily, and other things do not. So typically lipid-loving substances move through more readily than water-loving substances. And we'll talk about that a little later when we get to sort of some of the more specifics about transport across that cell membrane. So the cell membrane really has four important functions. One is it helps to determine what can enter and exit the cell. It is what we call semi-permeable. So some things, again, move through pretty readily. Other things need things like transport proteins to get across. And we'll talk about some of the individual ways that things move across that cell membrane. It also contains receptors for things like hormones, neurotransmitters, and other kind of chemical signals to allow a system of communication throughout the body. There will be a lot of instances during this class when we talk about the pathophysiology of a lot of disease states that you'll see the importance of all of that kind of receptor transmission and communication, and then what can go wrong when that is disrupted. The cell membrane also contains transporters that can help to move ions across the membrane, and that is going to be really important for electrical signaling. We'll talk about things in this presentation as well about action potentials that are essential for electrical signaling throughout the body. And the final important function of the cell membrane is to help regulate cell growth and division. We're not going to talk too in depth about cell division. We're going to talk about kind of the two different types at one point, but again, another important function of that cell membrane. All right, the next important topic we're going to talk about is cellular respiration, really talking about how cells produce energy that the body needs to carry out essential functions. So we're going to talk about both aerobic and anaerobic energy production pathways here. So just some basics, the energy is our ability to do work, right? Cells typically use oxygen to transform the nutrients from our food into energy so that the cells can do their basic functions. So we need energy for muscles to work, to maintain this active transport of ions across the cell membrane. We use energy to make enzymes. We use energy to make hormones. Basically, everything that is occurring within the body requires energy for it to work. When we talk about what the carrier for energy or the currency for energy inside the body, that is what we call ATP. ATP is the carrier for cellular energy, or what we call the energy currency of the cell. And there are two types of energy production pathways within the body, two ways that we make that ATP. One is anaerobic or without oxygen, and the other is aerobic within the presence of oxygen. So we're going to start with the anaerobic metabolism pathway. This occurs within the cytoplasm of the cell. We also call this the glycolytic pathway, and this can occur without the presence of oxygen. The glycolytic pathway is actually the starting phase of both aerobic and anaerobic pathways. We'll look at how that happens in the aerobic pathway momentarily, but in the absence of both mitochondria and oxygen, we can continue to carry through this anaerobic pathway. So both pathways start with glycolysis, which is the process of releasing energy from glucose. So here you see my little glucose molecule. It's a 6-chain carbon molecule, and we start to break that down. And that breakdown does require the use of some energy. So you see that here, my little ATP, it uses 2 ATP to produce or to break down that glucose, okay? So without oxygen, that pyruvic acid, which you see here, which is produced by that breakdown of glucose using up some energy, that pyruvic acid is actually converted to something called lactic acid. So lactic acid is the byproduct of anaerobic metabolism. And that lactic acid production allows this cycle to kind of continue. Okay, so this cycle will produce some ATP, but it produces far less ATP than what we see in aerobic pathways. And it also, again, produces this byproduct called lactic acid. We're going to talk more about lactic acid throughout the course as well. The buildup of lactic acid is something that becomes problematic for an organism because it can lead to things like metabolic acidosis. So this is not what I would call benign byproduct as well. So two things again are happening here in this anaerobic metabolism situation. One is that we don't produce as much ATP. It's not as efficient of a pathway as the aerobic pathway that we'll talk about momentarily. And it's also producing this byproduct called lactic acid that the body needs to get rid of. Its buildup can cause additional problems that we'll talk about later. So why would we need this anaerobic pathway if it's producing these byproducts that are problematic and it's not producing ATP? Well, there are some situations where we have an overall kind of systemic reduction in our oxygen availability. So conditions like circulatory shock or cardiac arrest create a systemic anaerobic condition. And this causes our body to still need energy, right? We still need to produce ATP, but with that reduced oxygen, we're doing it in an anaerobic state. So in those anaerobic states, we're producing lactic acid and less ATP. We continue to produce energy, but at a much lower rate. So all of those things that we talked about previously that need energy within the body will not be working as well. So again, things like um, our ion channels that require energy within the body, our production of hormones, our production of enzymes, our ability of muscles to work, all of those things won't have the same level of energy that we generally need. Okay, so let's contrast that. We'll contrast that to aerobic metabolism. Okay, so aerobic metabolism occurs in the mitochondria and it occurs in the presence of oxygen. So instead of lactic acid as that byproduct of glycolysis, like we saw in anaerobic metabolism, our byproducts here are harmless carbon dioxide and water, so we're not producing that lactic acid. And the cycle creates more ATP per glucose molecule than we saw in that anaerobic pathway. So much more efficient. In this system of metabolism, we produce pyruvic acid just like we did in anaerobic metabolism. But now that pyruvic acid travels into the mitochondria and continues to produce ATP here with byproducts of water and carbon dioxide. So no lactic acid production. So simply benign byproducts and more ATP. So much more efficient, the preferred way to produce energy in the body. So the next topic we'll talk about is membrane transport mechanisms. So we're going to focus on diffusion, osmosis, and active transport here. So the first type of transport we'll talk about across the cell membrane is diffusion. So basic diffusion, a substance is moving from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. And so in the picture you see here, you'll notice that the substances, these little blue dots, are equal on either side of the cell membrane. So if that's the case, you don't really have any net movement across that cell membrane, right? So my little cell membrane, my phospholipid bilayer with my water-loving or hydrophilic heads and my lipid-loving or lipophilic tails, right? Sitting here, and then I have solutes moving across each side. So again, they're equal on each side of my cell membrane, so I don't have any net movement. If I had perhaps more solutes on this side of the membrane and just a couple here, I would see net movement of those substances across the cell membrane to their area of lower concentration until they sort of even themselves out, right? And so remember we said with that cell membrane and the way that it's structured, it's much easier for lipid-loving or lipophilic substances to move across that membrane. And so that's things like oxygen, carbon dioxide, alcohol, steroid hormones, they move really readily across. But things that are water-loving or substances that are hydrophilic in nature, they need some kind of passage or transport or something to kind of help them move through that cell membrane. Okay. The next type of movement across the cell membrane that we'll talk about is facilitated diffusion. And so the facilitated diffusion is the passage of a substance across the cell membrane that is either too large to pass through readily or is lipophobic. Okay. So an example of that is a glucose molecule. And so in the picture, this demonstrates facilitated diffusion. And so that substance, like glucose, needs to be aided in its transport across the cell membrane, typically by a protein. And those proteins can either be a carrier protein, which is what is depicted here, or a protein kind of channel. And so in this case, again, that you see in the picture, in this type of facilitated diffusion, we have a carrier protein, okay? And so our substance comes along towards the cell membrane. So here's our little glucose, and it attaches itself to a little carrier protein here on the surface of that cell membrane. And that carrier protein takes that little glucose molecule across that lipid bilayer and into the cell, right? So now my little glucose molecule has made it across my phospholipid bilayer into the cell via a carrier protein in that bilayer. Another important thing to understand is that this process does not require energy. No energy is expended here. That's really why it's diffusion. It's just facilitated by a protein, but not by energy. So the rate of movement of this is determined by two things. One, the concentration of the substance. So if I have a large concentration of substance on the outside of my cell, it's going to be a much, I guess, faster process than if it was a smaller concentration. But it's also determined by protein availability. So if I don't have many carrier proteins, but I have a whole bunch of substances that need it to get across, I'm still not going to move very quickly, right? And so sometimes within the body, we have signaling mechanisms that tell us to increase the amount of carrier proteins available so that we can get all these substances across. That's what's happening with something like insulin. When we produce insulin in the body in response to high levels of glucose in the blood, the insulin is signaling us to create more carrier proteins. And in the presence of more carrier proteins for glucose, we get more movement of glucose across the cell membranes because we have more available proteins. Okay? The next type of transport across the cell really is going to talk about how water moves across. So this is osmosis. So it's the movement of water typically through water channels within that cell membrane. So water also moves down its concentration gradient, but it's regulated by the concentration of impermeable substances. So there's some substance that's pulling water across the cell membrane. Okay, so you can see in my little picture on the outside of the cell membrane, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 substances. And on the inside, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So a higher concentration of substances inside of the cell than I have outside. And so water is going to move down its concentration gradient. It's going to be pulled towards the area that has the higher concentration of substances. Okay, and it's going to move until the concentration of those substances is equal. Okay. The next type of transport across a cell membrane is active transport. And the big thing to remember here is that this requires energy. It requires the expenditure of ATP to act. And what's happening here is we're trying to maintain a different concentration of a substance on one side of a cell membrane than the other. One of the most common examples of this and one of the most common types of active transport that we see in the body is the sodium-potassium pump. So we're trying to maintain a concentration gradient of potassium and sodium across that cell membrane. Okay? If active transport systems are unable to function, and the biggest thing that makes this unable to function happen is the lack of energy, then our active transport mechanism fails. So in the case of the sodium-potassium pump, if we run out of ATP, then sodium starts to increase its concentration inside the cell because we don't have that pump to prevent this from happening. and we start to get sodium increasing inside the cell. Okay. If you remember back to osmosis, if we get this increase in the concentration of sodium inside the cell, now it's going to start to pull water towards it, and the cell can start to swell and die. So it's really important to maintain active transport, to maintain those appropriate concentration gradients, because if we do not, we can start to see damage and death to the cells. We're going to talk about that again and again, but it'll be important to understand that mechanism. All right, so the next piece here is going to be membrane potential, and this is directly tied to that active transport piece we just talked about. So membrane potentials are created by maintaining these differing concentrations of ions on either side of that cell membrane. This creates an electrical potential across the membrane. We also call this membrane potentials. So changes in these membrane potentials are necessary for things like movement of nerve impulses within the body, for contraction of muscles, for stimulating hormone secretion. So maintaining these membrane potentials and changing them when signaled within the body is essential for all of these things like nerve impulse, contraction of muscles, hormone secretion. Okay. So within the body, we have what we refer to as a resting membrane potential. So again, this is necessary for the electrical excitability of our cells. A resting membrane potential is permeable, a resting cell membrane is permeable to potassium. So it diffuses out of the cell across its concentration gradient, but as it does this, it leaves behind its negative charge, okay? So in this picture, here's my cell membrane. So here's the inside of the cell, here's the outside of the cell, and at rest, you can see that all my little negative charges are lined up inside the cell, and my positive charges are lined up outside the cell. Again, you see I've got my potassium, my positively charged potassium, and it's moving down its concentration gradient. So net movement of potassium out of the cell, leaving behind its little negative charges inside and its positive charges outside, giving me that resting membrane potential with positive out and negative in. Our sodium-potassium pump further helps to aid this resting membrane potential by pulling out or pumping out 3 sodium ions. You see them here, 3 positive sodium ions are pumped out of the cell, and it returns 2 positively charged potassium ions. So if I'm moving in 2 positive charges, but moving out 3 positive charges, I'm getting again a negative positive, a a net positive movement out of the cell. So it further adds to that positive charge out, negative charge in of my resting membrane potential. We call that polarization. Okay. Sodium, calcium, and potassium are all ions involved in action potentials across the cell membrane. And various signals within the body can cause the opening and closing of these ion channels, allowing these electrolytes to then move quickly across the cell membranes. Okay. This is important to remember because when we discuss things later on, like electrolytes and their imbalance, you'll find that disruption of levels of things like, again, sodium, calcium, potassium in the body, the disruption of those ions will disrupt the action potentials within the body, and that causes a lot of the clinical manifestations that we see with those electrical or electrolyte imbalances. So largely things like muscle or nervous tissue related, okay? We also have medications, and you'll talk about these a lot in your pharmacology class, that can affect various electrolyte pumps or electrolyte channels. We manipulate those pumps and channels to change the excitability of these membranes. Okay. So when there is some kind of signal from within the body to stimulate our body to produce an action potential, we get this rapid change in the cell membrane potential, or the polarization of that cell membrane. So some triggering event is causing those typically sodium channels to open. And as those sodium channels open, they allow this large influx of sodium to enter the cell. And remember that sodium is positively charged. So now all those positively charged ions that were selectively sitting outside of the cell membrane are kind of now flooding in to the cell and rapidly depolarizing that cell. And so now instead of that positive charge being on the outside, it's flooding into the inside of my cell and giving me a negative charge outside, okay? So again, here's my little cell. Here's my outside of my cell and my inside of the cell. Some triggering event caused those sodium channels to open up. Sodium rushed into the cell, and now I've got positive charge inside, negative charge outside, and we call this an action potential. And this is what triggers action within the cell, whether it's a nervous signal to travel forward, whether it's contraction of a muscle, whether it's release of a hormone. Some triggering event causes that excitability of that cell membrane to release an action potential. Okay. All right. So we're going to move on from the cell, and we're going to talk about the 4 different types of tissues within the cell. And the unit learning outcome here is to really kind of compare and contrast the different types of tissues. So I'm going to point out some of the things about each tissue type that I think will be important, again, for understanding some of the disease states moving forward. So we're going to start with epithelial tissue. And with each type of tissue, we're going to talk about the function, the location, and some important distinguishing features of each. So with epithelial tissue, the overall function here is really protection, secretion, absorption, and excretion. So epithelial tissues cover all of our body surfaces, so the external surface of the body, and they also line internal cavities and tubes, so things like the GI tract. And they also form things like ducts around glands that allow glandular secretion in the body. Some of the important distinguishing features to understand about the epithelial tissue is one is that it's avascular in nature. So because it's avascular, it relies on maintaining its level of moisture. It relies on close contact between those cells, so they're really tightly kind of bunched close together. And it requires close contact to things like capillary beds for nutrients to be provided to epithelial tissue and also for waste products to be taken away. The cells of the epithelial tissue are really closely tight together. This helps to form those barriers that we talk about. So the functions of things like protection, it's really important to have those cells kind of tightly packed together. The other important thing to know about epithelial tissue is that it's capable of cell division and rapid cell turnover. So within the body, the cells of the epithelial linings are turning over kind of all the time. So they are capable of cell division and turnover. The next type of tissue is connective tissue. The overall function of connective tissue is to connect, right? To bind and to support various tissues within the body. Connective tissue is very widely distributed because we have a lot of different types of connective tissue. Okay, it's a very diverse type of tissue. So this is things like adipose or fat tissue, our cartilage, our bone, blood is a connective tissue. So a lot of different types and diverse nature. One important distinguishing feature here is the cells of the connective tissue produce what we call the extracellular matrix that helps to support and hold all of our tissues together. And we're going to talk a lot about this extracellular matrix when we talk about things like inflammatory processes within the body, when we talk about things like wound healing, when we talk about how things like soft tissue heals, how bone heals. This extracellular matrix and the function of the connective tissue within the production of that matrix will become very important. The next type of tissue is muscle tissue. The overall function of muscle tissue is contraction and movement. Okay? We have 3 types of muscle tissue. We have cardiac, skeletal, and smooth muscle. So cardiac muscle tissue is your heart. Skeletal muscle are those the muscles of your body that help you to move. And smooth muscle is found within internal organs, so things like your GI tract that need to also contract. Okay. A major distinguishing feature of muscle tissue, especially skeletal and cardiac muscle, is that it cannot divide. So if you injure muscle tissue, it doesn't do what epithelial tissue does and just produce more cells. We don't replace those injured cells. Okay, so we need different mechanisms to repair injury within skeletal and cardiac muscle. Smooth muscle, on the other hand, can replace itself. And the final type of tissue is nervous tissue, and its main function is communication within the body. So its location is really throughout the body, but it's divided into central and peripheral nervous systems. We'll talk about that a lot more throughout the class. And its major distinguishing feature is that it starts out very highly differentiated. So at birth, nervous tissue is very highly differentiated, and most nervous tissue is not capable of regeneration after postnatal life. So again, if we damage or if we destroy nerve tissue, we can't regenerate. We can't remake those cells.